3, 2, 1.
We'd like to welcome you to another edition of GrokTALK, brought to you by New Hampshire's leading conservative blog site, GrokTALK.com. We are your feared extremist, right-wing, hard-charging, gun-toting, opinionated, outspoken, rabble-rousing, letter-writing, radio microphone-stomping conservatives and rational libertarians. So get ready for more news and opinion you could only get from GrokTALK.com.
GrokTALK.
It is my distinct honor to introduce you to a man who is younger than me, inspired me to get off the couch and do something. This senator stood on the floor for over 21 hours and only loosened his tie. Only loosened his tie a half an inch. At the end of that, he said, all 100 senators work for us. With that, will you help me welcome Senator Ted Cruz?
You better run, buddy. Mark my words, my friend. You have a coalition like you don't even understand.
Better run. Thank you.
Michelle.
Come on in. Can you say hi to Mr.
Hi.
You want to give him a high five?
Oh, give me five.
Yeah.
Excellent. Wow. God bless the great state of New Hampshire. Live free or die. That is exactly right. Listen, I am thrilled to be here. I'm thrilled that y'all would take time away from your families. Now I understood that the first invitation to come to this event was to Hillary Clinton. But apparently they couldn't get a foreign nation to foot the bill. By the way, I have to say, we've seen some exciting news on the Democratic side of the aisle. Ready for Hillary has announced their director of email security. And it's good to see Lois Lerner has a new job. Listen, I am thrilled to be here with so many patriots. What I'm going to do is I'm going to speak about 5 minutes, and then I want to open it up to questions and have a conversation, because the whole point here is to talk about the issues that are weighing on your heart. But I want to just give you a word of encouragement first. Every one of us knows the threats facing this country are enormous. Look, I think there is an urgency to politics today that is unlike anything any of us have ever seen. It is now or never. I don't think we've reached the point of no return yet, but we're close. We are close. And I believe if we go 4 or 8 more years on this same path, we risk losing the greatest country in the history of the world. But the word of encouragement I want to give you is people are waking up. One of the great blessings of serving and representing the state of Texas in the Senate is I get to travel around the country. I get to see what's happening. What's happening here, I'm telling you, it is happening across the country. Millions of Americans are realizing this isn't working. The Obama economy is a disaster. Obamacare is a train wreck. And the Obama-Clinton foreign policy of leading from behind, the whole world's on fire. The world is on fire. Yes, your world is on fire. But you know what? Your mommy's here, and everyone's here to make sure that the world you grow up in is even better. Let me tell you, we know the path to turning this country around. It is getting back to the common sense values America was built on. It is getting back to free market principles, getting back to constitutional liberties. Look, I think the path is real simple. Number one, we need to bring back jobs and growth and opportunity. Now, how does that happen? Jobs don't come from Washington. Lord knows they don't come from Washington. They come from you. They come from men and women in the private sector. But government is very good at screwing it up. And we know historically the two levers that are most important that government has to facilitate small businesses creating jobs. And those are tax reform and regulatory reform. On tax reform, we need to dramatically simplify the IRS code, and ideally, we need to adopt a simple flat tax. So that every American can fill out his or her taxes on a postcard. And we need to abolish the IRS. There are 110,000 agents at the IRS. We need to put a padlock on that building and take every one of those 110,000 agents and put them on our southern border. Now, look, I say that somewhat tongue-in-cheek, but think about it for a minute. Imagine you had traveled thousands of miles in the blinding sun. You're dripping wet. You swim the Rio Grande, and the first thing you see is 110,000 IRS agents? You'd turn around and go home, too. And then regulatory reform. We need to stop the out-of-control regulators who are descending like locusts on small businesses across this country. I was out in West Texas once, and I said, you know, the difference is, unlike locusts, you can't use pesticide on the regulators. And this old farmer in the back looked at me and said, want to bet? And the most important regulatory reform is we need to repeal every word of Obamacare. We've got to get back to defending our constitutional liberties. We've never seen a federal government come after the Bill of Rights like this administration. We need to defend the First Amendment, our free speech, our religious liberty. We need to defend the Second Amendment. I'm pretty sure here in New Hampshire, y'all define gun control like we do down in Texas. Gun control means hitting what you aim at.
We started in New Hampshire in the last election by taking over the legislature, the state of New Hampshire.
You are exactly right, taking over the legislature, which y'all did here on the ground. And we need to restore America's leadership in the world. Just 2 weeks ago, we saw Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu come before a joint session of Congress, speaking with a clarity that I'll tell you the adjective that was most frequently applied was Churchillian. Speaking about the threat to Israel, to America, and the world that a nuclear Iran poses. And what do we see? We see the White House attacking and undermining our friends and allies while they coddle and appease our enemies. But here's the word of encouragement. Everywhere across this country, people are waking up and realizing we got to change course. And it will not come from Washington. If you're looking to Washington for hope, you will have nothing but despair and despondency. Trust me, I've been there and I've seen it firsthand. The only way we turn this country around is it comes from the American people. I am encouraged, I am hopeful, I am optimistic because of each and every one of you. Because of the passion each and every one of you has to have a better country for your kids and grandkids to rise up and say, look, we can change direction and sovereignty at the end of the day. Doesn't rest with a bunch of politicians. It is with we the people. I'm optimistic because of you. And if we're going to turn this country around, and I'm convinced we're going to, it is going to take each and every one of us standing up and going to our friends and neighbors and saying, let's take this country back. Let's get back to what has made America a beacon of hope and freedom for the world for centuries. From the beginning of this country, God's providential blessing has been on America. And I'll tell you, I'm convinced God is not done with America yet. And with that, I am happy to answer or dodge any question you like. Yes, ma'am.
Senator, you say let's take this country back. Mm-hmm. This is town meeting month in New Hampshire. And across the state, town meetings, people are speaking out, and they're saying they want big money out of politics. They're passing resolutions right now. So my question is, if elected president, what would you do to stop corporations and billionaires from influencing public policy that often contradicts the interests of regular people like those of us here? Like Soros.
Well, listen, that's a very good question. The question was, what can we do to stop big money in politics? And let me talk both principle and practicality. Let's start with principle. I think when it comes to campaign finance reform, it's one of the most misunderstood issues in terms of the debate. I am, first and foremost, a constitutionalist. I believe in the Constitution and I believe in the Bill of Rights. We saw last year, you probably didn't see it because it wasn't covered in the local media, but Senate Democrats introduced and voted on an amendment to repeal the free speech protections of the First Amendment. Every single Senate Democrat voted to repeal the free speech protections of the First Amendment. Listen, I believe in free speech in the First Amendment, which means that I believe everyone here has a right to speak out on politics as effectively as possible. To speak out and make your views known, whether that is standing on a street corner on a soapbox, whether that is printing a yard sign, whether that is spending money to run a radio ad or a TV ad, effectively communicating. And what happens on these issues is inevitably the people pushing to limit free speech are incumbent politicians in Washington. And no one should be surprised that when incumbent politicians in Washington pass regulations on spending money in politics, the people who are benefited are incumbent politicians in Washington. So in the Senate, I introduced legislation that I called the Super PAC Elimination Act of 2014. What it did was very simple. It eliminated contribution limits from individuals to any candidate. And then it required immediate disclosure within 24 hours. As a practical matter, if we did that, super PACs would go away. Right now, the system is crazy. Look, the system is designed so that nobody can beat an incumbent politician. You look at campaign finance reform, it's sold to people, let's lower limits, let's make it harder and harder to raise money. What happens is a challenger can't raise money. You look under the federal limits, let's take a state like the state of Texas. When I began running in Texas, Texas has 26 million people. It is an expensive state. The federal limits make it practically impossible for someone who is not an incumbent politician or who is not a multimillionaire to run. What we ought to be doing instead is empowering every citizen to speak up. And the way you do that is, number one, you require disclosure so we can know who's contributing what to whom. But number two, you stop trying to muzzle individual citizens from speaking out. Listen, in the Senate race, when I ran, I had $35 million in nasty attack ads run against me. And you know what? It was their constitutional rights to do so. It was their constitutional rights to speak out. And I agree with John Stuart Mill, who said the best cure for bad speech is more speech. And every time you see elected officials trying to restrict speech, it's interesting. The people who are allowed to talk are, number one, the media. You hear a lot of times, well, money's not speech. Well, let's be clear. There is not a person in this room that agrees with that statement. Money absolutely can be speech from day one. You look at the first constitutional amendment the Democrats introduced last year that would have given Congress the authority to prohibit any individual in this room spending any money on political speech. That literally means if Catherine decides she wants to put a yard sign and she goes down to Home Depot and spends $5 buying a piece of cardboard and a stick, Congress could make that a criminal offense. That has never been the case. Money has always been integral to speech. You take something like the Federalist Papers. The beginning of our country, we printed up speech. That takes money. The New York Times spends millions of dollars with giant printing presses. Speaking. I think the answer is not to muzzle citizens, it's to empower citizens across this country, and that diminishes the role of big money when everyone can speak and citizens can speak the loudest. Yes, ma'am. Well, thank you very much for that question, and thank you for your ministry. Thank you for speaking up and being involved. Let me speak generally about immigration and then specifically about the question you asked, if I might. On immigration generally, I am both optimistic and pessimistic. I'm optimistic because I think outside of Washington, there is tremendous bipartisan agreement on immigration. Outside of Washington, there is overwhelming bipartisan agreement that we've got to get serious about securing the borders and stopping the problem of illegal immigration. And there is also, outside of Washington, substantial bipartisan agreement that we need to improve and streamline legal immigration. That we need to remain a nation that... We need to remain a nation that doesn't just welcome but celebrates legal immigrants. I am the son of a legal immigrant who came legally from Cuba seeking freedom. And there is no stronger advocate of legal immigration in the Senate than I am. If we focus on bipartisan areas of agreement, securing the border, and improving and streamlining legal immigration, we could craft a bill that could sail through Congress. Unfortunately, to date, President Obama and the Senate Democrats, I believe, have been more interested in seeking partisan advantage than actually solving the problem. Now, your specific question dealt with detention facilities for those who are coming here illegally. And on the question of for-profit versus alternatives, that's a question. I'm happy to look at the materials you have developed, and there's no doubt we should be doing whatever is the most efficient, cost-effective way to deal with it. But the best solution to that is actually secure the border so we're not having to detain vast numbers of people. Yes, sir.
crouching for our whole perspective. Why are you all sitting back and not doing anything about this?
Well, sir, let me start by saying thank you for your service serving the country, both in the Marines, and thank you also for serving in the legislature now. Listen, you are exactly right. What we are doing to the military is unconscionable. We have seen under this administration the impact of sequestration on our readiness, on our ability to defend this nation, has been crippling, and the world has only gotten more and more dangerous. I am hopeful with a new Republican majority that we will begin to see real leadership in Congress to restore the funding that is needed to defend this nation. You know, I can tell you, last year, I'm on the Senate Armed Services Committee. And last year we had a hearing where Secretary of Defense Hagel was there and the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs, General Dempsey, was there. And I asked about the Navy's algae fuel program. The Navy spent about $160 million on algae fuel, fueling ships from algae. To do the exact same thing would have cost about $40 million using conventional energy sources. So I asked Secretary Hagel, would you agree that wasting $120 million doesn't make sense at a time when we're really compromising our readiness? It's interesting. Secretary Hagel responded and said, well, I would agree that the algae fuel program is a, quote, luxury. That was his own words. And I said, well, Mr. Secretary, did it occur to you, did you look at cutting the luxuries before you begin forcibly retiring captains, before you begin degrading the ability to defend this nation? And I'm sorry to say his answer was no, didn't occur to us at all. Yes, sir.
Senator, as a member of the Constitutional Conservatives of New Hampshire, I have a very important question to ask. We want to find out when you are going to announce your candidacy for president.
Right, that's what we're all here for, aren't we? That's what we're all here for.
Well, thank you, sir, for the very, very kind question. Listen, I am looking at it very, very seriously.
No dodging.
Yes or no?
I am looking at it very, very seriously. I will point out, a week ago, I was in Iowa. Yesterday, I was in South Carolina, and today I'm in New Hampshire. Well, and let me actually speak for a minute about, listen, the encouragement we are seeing, particularly on the grassroots, on the ground, has been breathtaking. And let me tell you one of the reasons why I'm looking at it so seriously. Listen, I think every one of us here feels the urgency. We have got to win in November 2016. Now, if you look in business, conservatives are very good to looking at the numbers, looking at the data, doing due diligence before we allocate capital, before we make a decision. And yet in politics, there are these Washington consultants that are completely data-free. If you compare 2004, the last race we won nationally, to 2008 and 12, by far the biggest difference are the millions of conservatives who showed up in 04, who stayed home in 08, and stayed home in even bigger numbers in 2012. And the central question, I believe, if we're going to win in 2016, is how do we bring the millions of conservatives who've been staying home back to the polls? Yes, sir.
Hopefully, President Cruz. I am just an average business owner. We're here from Massachusetts. We have a small little radio show in Boston, a little group. We have single-handedly stopped the automatic gasoline tax in Massachusetts, which is taxation without representation. We extensively with the show. I'm just a piece of the puzzle, but we got Justina Pelletier out of communist Massachusetts. We have single-handedly held a rally and stopped all the illegal immigrants from being shipped from Texas to Massachusetts. I'm not here for any other reason to know whether you want to run, because we can read people well. We know who represents us. We took over so many seats in 2010. In 2014, where is our Republican representation? We don't have any still. We did put in Charlie Baker. You don't understand the groundswell movement. The media hushes us up. Fox News hushes up that it won't put you on. They're in the tank for the Rhino Republicans, and we are tired of it. We need to take the country back now. You have plenty of people on the ground to do all. You don't need the money. We're all up here for free, bringing homemade food. We're bringing it, right? My wife gave me a blank check, for God's sakes, if I can find it.
God love her.
Take my house. You don't understand. This is the last stand. It is D-Day in America, folks. I don't know. I know you realize it, but it's D-Day. We can't wait for another Republican. We need Ted Cruz, and I don't care who he runs with. We need him, and that is it. We need you. You don't need the money. We got all the money in the world. We have all the money in the world, Ted. I'm done calling radio shows. Limbaugh and Mark Levin, they don't do anything. They talk. It's cheap. We're here.
Look, I will note, for those who believe in miracles, this gentleman just threw his wallet at a politician. And he actually got it back.
And I want you to take it.
Listen, let me say, number one, thank you. Thank you for your passionate voice. Thank you for your encouragement. Let me say two things. Number one, stay tuned. And number two, let me share a story. So you may know, Heidi and I, we have two little girls. There you go. So how old is your daughter who was here just a second ago? She's 3. So all right. Oh, okay, so she's Nicholas's brother. Gotcha. Excellent. So our girls are 4 and 6. Catherine's 4, Caroline's 6. Now, every parent here, you know that God makes every child very different. Catherine, the baby, is the sweetest little girl. She'll crawl in your lap and she'll just hug on you. That's just Catherine. That's how she's made. Caroline is a rascal. But I want to tell you a conversation I had with Caroline about a month ago. So we gave both girls a few months ago a little baby puppy. It's a little white puppy named Snowflake. We'd been holding out for a year until one night Caroline was on her knees saying her prayers at night, and she looked up and she said, "Dear Jesus, please, please, please bring me a puppy." And our hearts broke, and the next week, Snowflake arrived. Now, we live in a high-rise condo in Houston. So Caroline, about a month ago, she came to me. She had her arms crossed. She said, "Okay, Dad, I've decided it's okay if you run for president." Because she said, if you win, it'll mean Snowflake will finally get a backyard to pee in. So that is Caroline Cruz's political analysis for the greatest need in this country. Yes, sir.
Senator, I want to go along with Representative's commentary. I'm not thinking a lot of people in this room know me, but I think what you're seeing here is the turnout is a testament to your courageous stance in the Senate. You're standing up.
Absolutely. The Lone Ranger progressive.
Well, Jack, thank you very much. I could not agree more emphatically. Barack Obama is the most lawless president this country has ever seen. You know, I don't know if any of y'all are familiar with a liberal constitutional law professor named Jonathan Turley, who Professor Turley testified before Congress. Now, Turley voted for Obama. And what Professor Turley has said is Barack Obama has become the embodiment of the imperial presidency. Barack Obama is the president Richard Nixon always wished he could be. The danger is enormous. You're exactly right. We need to stand up against the lawlessness and defend the Constitution. And let me take a minute to talk about the Iran letter and the reaction to that, because that is, I think, very relevant. So 47 of us signed in the Senate a letter to Iran informing Iran how our basic constitution operates. And that letter said very simply, under our Constitution, for anything to be binding law in the United States of America, it must either be a treaty submitted to the Senate and ratified by 2/3 of the Senate, or a law passed by Congress and signed into law by the President. That Barack Obama cannot sit down with Supreme Leader Khamenei, negotiate a deal that undermines American national security, negotiate a deal that paves the way for Iran to acquire a nuclear weapon, and have that be binding on the United States of America. Now, you know, the hysteria from the White House and Democrats in response to that letter reveals a lot. As Shakespeare put it, methinks she doth protest too much. Now listen, we shouldn't have to write a letter. How many of you, okay, a bunch of y'all, there are a bunch of people in 7th and 8th grade. Where is some of the 7th and 8th graders who were here? All right. You guys in school, they teach you basic civics, that a treaty has to go to the Senate to be ratified. Well, I'm sorry to tell you, the President doesn't have the understanding of the Constitution demonstrated by this young 8th grader. The reason that letter was necessary is because this President's saying over and over again it's his intention not to submit the treaty to the Senate, not to submit the law to the Congress, but rather to try to unilaterally decree it. No President of the United States has any authority to make law in this country. It has to be pursuant to the Constitution. And Jack, your point about the United Nations, in response, the Obama White House is saying they want to go to the United Nations to end-run the Congress, end-run federal law, and end-run the Constitution. Well, I'll tell you, before I was in the Senate, I was the Solicitor General of Texas, the chief lawyer for the state in front of the U.S. Supreme Court. The biggest fight we fought was a case called Medellin versus Texas. I would encourage you to look it up. In that case, Texas stood against the United Nations, the World Court, 90 foreign nations, and the President of the United States. The central question in that case was twofold, and I'm going to take just a minute to tell you about that case because it's highly relevant to the UN issue here. The case began with a horrible crime of 2 teenage girls that were murdered in Houston. But in that case, the World Court, the judicial arm of the United Nations, issued an order to the U.S. to reopen the convictions of 51 murderers across this country. First time in history a foreign court's tried to bind the U.S. justice system. I argued the case twice in front of the U.S. Supreme Court. In addition to the World Court and the UN on the other side, the president who opposed us, I'm very sorry to say, was George W. Bush. And President Bush signed a 2-paragraph order that attempted to order the state courts to obey the World Court. Now listen, I sat down with the Attorney General at the time, and it was an unusual thing for the state of Texas to be litigating against the President of the United States, who was a Texan, who was the former governor of Texas, who was a Republican and a friend. And yet I'm proud to say I went in front of the Supreme Court on behalf of the state of Texas and said, no president, whether Democrat or Republican, has the authority to give away U.S. sovereignty. And Texas won by a vote of 6-3. The Supreme Court said the president cannot give away our sovereignty, and the United Nations has no authority to bind the United States of America. All right, yes, ma'am. I'm getting the hook, so this is our last question. Well, ma'am, thank you very much for your question, and thank you for being a mom to your 4 kids. I think we should repeal every word of Common Core. Look, education is far too important to have it governed by unelected bureaucrats down in Washington. Education, I mentioned before in response to the first question, I'm a constitutionalist. Over and over again, as questions come up, my touchstone is going to be, what does the Constitution of the United States say? If you look to the 10th Amendment, or as President Obama calls it, the what? The basic protection that says the powers not given to the federal government are reserved to the states and to the people. That means the federal government has no authority to do things like set the curriculum in education. That needs to be at the state level, or even better, at the local level. And, ma'am, the reason for that you actually described beautifully, which is, listen, if it's at the local level, you can go to the Strafford County School Board meeting, and if the curriculum being taught to your kids doesn't make sense, you can make your voice heard. You can speak out and say, this isn't right. Every one of us should have control over what's being taught to our kids. If it's bureaucrats in Washington, they don't care what you think or I think. It's about accountability to the people. That's the answer, getting back to the Constitution, back to the freedom this country was built on, and it's ultimately about empowering the people. That's why y'all are here, and I just want to say finally, y'all inspire me. Thank you for fighting for this country. The only way we will turn this country around is every one of us side by side saying, we will not go quietly into the night. Thank you, and God bless you.
He's Steve, I'm Skip, and I want to say, and thank. Hard to tell on the radio. Absolutely. Have a headset for a second.
I'm Susan Olsen. I'm a fellow Texan. Welcome. They got beans in the chili, though.
Well, Senator, I want to say thank you very much for coming over to talk with us at Granite Rock, and we enjoyed our constitutional talk yesterday, conversation. The other question I would have is, we talked about a number of the amendments yesterday. What were some of the things that we didn't touch upon that you think are important that we might have missed yesterday?
Well,
as far as governance is concerned, based on which wrong track we're going on.
I think yesterday we had a terrific conversation, Skip. I appreciate having the conversation now in person, but I'll tell you, when we hung up, I was in the Atlanta airport on a layover, and we had, a 20, 30-minute conversation that I'll tell you, I called our team afterwards and said that was one of the most substantive, serious conversations I've had in terms of discussions of the issues. So let me compliment the degree of depth that we got into on constitutional issues. In terms of additional areas, the biggest one I would focus on is the need to empower the people to hold elected officials accountable.
$260.
I don't think we will be able to turn this country around if the answer comes from Washington. I think what's got to happen is it's got to be the grassroots holding all of us accountable. So I'll tell you what I said when I was campaigning for Senate across Texas. Over and over again, I told men and women, hold me accountable, hold every elected official accountable, demand that we do what we said we would do. I think that is the most potent avenue for change, is changing the dynamics so that we, the people, are empowered.
Every single person,
do we have a winner?
Every person who holds elective office swears an oath to the Constitution.
Yes.
And there was a movement here in New Hampshire a little while ago called Honor Your Oath, because we see a lot of politicians not. It's sort of a prerequisite to taking their seats, and then it's forever gone.
Right.
We saw a small effort in the Congress to say you have to justify your bill by what it said in the Constitution. It didn't go anywhere.
Yep.
Has there ever been a motion in Congress to say these words mean something instead of just being gobbledygook? Is there any way that you could say you need to honor your oath, and if you don't, there would be a penalty outside of what the voters would do? Right. And as we see now, it's if any Democrat can do anything, Republican can do anything, instead of what we were talking about yesterday, it's the Constitution and your honor that's at risk.
Well, listen, I think that each of us is honor-bound to honor our oath. At the end of the day, I think the most significant check on it is the people holding us accountable. But the question you're asking needs to be asked by citizens, by the media. And I'll give an example. When I was newly elected to the Senate a couple of years ago, one of the very first things that happened is I had a fairly notable exchange with California Democrat Senator Dianne Feinstein, where she was proposing her so-called assault weapons ban that I believed infringed upon the Second Amendment right to keep and bear arms. And at the Judiciary Committee, I asked Senator Feinstein how she would justify this legislation, particularly given that the Second Amendment uses very, very similar language, the same operative language, the right of the people that's found in the First Amendment, our free speech rights and our rights to assemble, and also the Fourth Amendment, our privacy rights. Now, her response, she got very angry that I asked that question. And at one point in that back and forth, she said, "You don't understand. It's our job to pass legislation, then the courts figure out whether they're constitutional or not." And you may recall my response to that. I said, "Senator Feinstein, I understand very well, and that's been the problem for far too long. Congress has been passing legislation without asking, is this consistent with the Constitution? And every one of us takes an oath to follow the Constitution, and we're independently responsible for doing that." I think that there's not a rule you can pass in Congress to suddenly cause people to honor their oaths. The only check that is meaningful is if there's accountability back home, and the role you play and bloggers play and the media play of holding people accountable helps enable and empower the people to do just that.
If only the media would actually do exactly that and not just looking at the single letters after somebody's name. I know you've got to run. It's snowing hard up in Grafton County where you're heading next, so you need to skedaddle. And I want to say thank you very much for spending a few minutes with Granite Grok.
Well, thank you, and God bless you.
All right. Take care, sir.
Rock.